Good evening, my friends. Gather close and listen well. Imagine a desert so dry that even hope itself seems to crack beneath the sun. For generations, the northern lands of Burkina Faso have been a graveyard for seeds, a place where millet shriveled, corn withered, and families watched the wind carry away their dreams. But in January 2024, something happened that no one could have predicted. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before the nation and declared that 200,000 hectares of this wasteland would be turned into fields of cassava. Yes, cassava, the humble root that millions depend on for survival, the plant that laughs at poor soil and shrugs off drought. The numbers alone shook the world. 10 million tons of fresh cassava roots each year, enough to feed every Burkinabe citizen, with mountains left over for starch, ethanol, even plastics. To some, it was visionary. To others, it sounded like fantasy whispered on the wind. Could a crop truly rise from dust where nothing has grown for decades? Could a desert once cursed as hopeless become the breadbasket of the Sahel? As markets buzzed with rumor, women selling maize asked if food might finally become affordable. In the villages, old farmers rubbed their cracked hands, skeptical but curious. Hope and doubt collided in equal measure, and far beyond Ouagadougou, the world leaned in. Development agencies in Europe scoffed. Nigerian farmers pointed to their own cassava boom and said, yes, it can be done. Global traders began calculating what millions of tons of starch might mean for markets from Asia to America. But beneath the excitement and the headlines, one question lingers like a shadow across the sand. Is this truly the road to independence, or just another mirage shimmering under the burning Sahel sun? Stay with us, because the answer will shock you more than the announcement itself. The announcement came not in whispers but in thunder, in the heart of Ouagadougou, under the gaze of soldiers and citizens alike. Captain Ibrahim Traoré revealed what many thought was impossible. 200,000 hectares of desert, land where winds carried only dust and despair, would be turned into cassava fields. To understand the weight of this declaration, imagine an area larger than Luxembourg, carved out of sand and promised as farmland. It was not a proposal, it was a command to history itself. The government laid out its case with a precision that silenced even the most cynical voices. Cassava, they explained, is not like wheat or corn. It does not demand rivers of water or mountains of fertilizer. Once planted, it can resist both poor soil and harsh drought. Pilot plots in the north had already shown green shoots rising from barren ground. Where other crops surrendered, cassava stood its ground. For a nation battling climate change and food insecurity, the symbolism was striking. The desert was no longer an enemy, it was being conscripted into service. But the numbers told an even louder story. With high-yield varieties, the projected output reached nearly 10 million tons of fresh roots per year. That figure alone dwarfed national consumption. It promised a future where Burkina Faso would not only feed its own people, but export surpluses to neighbors and global markets. Imagine trucks rolling south with cassava flour for bread, or shipments of starch bound for Europe's textile factories. For a landlocked nation long trapped in dependency, the vision was staggering. On the streets of Ouagadougou, the reaction was immediate and emotional. In the Grand Marché, women who sold maize flour paused their work to whisper, "Will this mean cheaper food for our children?" In northern villages where hunger had become routine, elders shook their heads. Millet failed. Sorghum failed. Can cassava succeed where everything else has died? Their doubt was not born of malice, but of memory. Decades of broken promises, seeds that never sprouted, wells that never filled. Yet hope still flickered. Younger farmers spoke with cautious excitement. They had seen images of Nigerian and Brazilian cassava booms, lands once thought marginal, now flourishing with thick green leaves. If it could happen there, why not here? Engineers reinforced that optimism. Satellite images revealed vast swaths of desert already marked with survey stakes. Teams of workers mapped out irrigation routes, sketching canals that would snake across dunes. Trucks hauled in machinery rarely seen in the Sahel: bulldozers, excavators, pumps. For the first time, the desert was not just empty space. It was a battlefield, and the enemy was hunger. Still, the stakes were enormous. Irrigating even a fraction of the 200,000 hectares required infrastructure on a scale Burkina Faso had never attempted. Canals and reservoirs would have to endure brutal heat. Pumps would have to run constantly, fighting evaporation that devours water almost as quickly as it is poured. Every drop mattered, and every mistake would cost billions. The financial dimension loomed like a storm cloud. The state admitted that the project would consume billions of dollars over 5 years. For a country still grappling with insurgencies, schools in need, and hospitals under strain, it was a colossal gamble. Supporters hailed it as a bold strike for sovereignty. Critics warned it could drain resources with little to show but sand and broken pipes. But in a radio interview, one farmer summarized the dilemma more poignantly than any economist. Standing on his cracked plot of land, he said, "If this works, our children will eat. If it fails, our children will pay the price." His voice carried the raw truth of the Sahel. Hope and despair often live in the same breath. To the outside world, the announcement was met with skepticism. French agricultural reports mocked it as political theater. European analysts dismissed it as fantasy. Yet in Nigeria, farmers pointed to their own cassava revolution as proof that resilience was possible. Brazilian scientists offered technical expertise, citing decades of research. Ghana quietly prepared delegations to study the model. Thus, Burkina Faso's desert dream became more than a local story. It became a mirror for the entire Sahel, a region long caricatured as helpless. Could cassava change the narrative? Could it transform despair into defiance? And so the question hung in the air, heavier than the desert heat itself. Has Captain Ibrahim Traoré truly uncovered Africa's hidden weapon of survival, or has he led his nation into the cruelest mirage of all? The next chapter would reveal not just numbers on paper, but the human cost and the international intrigue swirling around this colossal gamble. The shock of Traoré's declaration rippled far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. What began as a bold domestic gamble quickly escalated into a regional and international spectacle. Within days of the announcement, newspapers across West Africa carried headlines that seemed torn between awe and disbelief. "Can cassava feed the Sahel?" one asked. Another scoffed, "A mirage in the desert." Inside Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was electric. In Ouagadougou's cafes, debates stretched late into the night. Economists on local radio shows sparred over numbers. Some argued the project was the only path to true independence from imported wheat and rice. Others warned that channeling billions into a single crop was reckless, especially in a country facing insurgent attacks in its northern provinces. One phrase dominated the airwaves: sovereignty. It was spoken with pride in some mouths, with unease in others. In the north, where the desert winds carried dust into every home, the announcement felt almost personal. For decades, families had watched their children migrate south in search of farmland, or flee abroad in search of jobs. Now, the promise of cassava fields sparked fragile hope. Local chiefs welcomed the idea, though their voices trembled. "We have heard promises before," one elder said. "But if the government brings water, if the plants live, then maybe we too will live." Yet hope was not the only force rising. Fear shadowed every conversation. Militants, still active in northern provinces, had a reputation for attacking infrastructure. Analysts warned. Canals, pumps, and storage facilities could become tempting targets. A successful harvest could turn into a battlefield if violence spread to the new farming zones. Was the government prepared to defend not just land but fragile irrigation lines across hundreds of miles of desert? The emotional crescendo came when a leaked document from the Ministry of Finance surfaced. It revealed that the project's total investment would exceed $2 billion over 5 years. The most alarming detail was a line item labeled Strategic Reserve, External Support, Origin Undisclosed. Whispers spread quickly. Who was footing the bill? Russia, seeking to expand its agricultural footprint in Africa? China, hungry for starch and ethanol to fuel its industries? Or shadowy Gulf investors hoping to buy influence in the Sahel? The government neither confirmed nor denied the document's authenticity. Silence only fueled speculation. On Ouagadougou streets, opinions hardened. A market trader dismissed concerns. Who cares where the money comes from, if it helps us eat? But a university professor warned on television, if the desert blooms with someone else's money, then the harvest may not belong to us. The line struck a chord, echoing across social media. Internationally, the responses grew sharper. In Paris, a French agricultural review scoffed. 200,000 hectares of cassava in the Sahel? This is political theater, not farming. Western media questioned whether Burkina Faso had the technical expertise to manage such a colossal undertaking. Development agencies in Brussels issued cautious statements, thinly veiled warnings about unsustainable ambitions. But in the global south, the tone was different. Nigerian farmers pointed to their own cassava boom as living proof that resilience was possible. Brazilian experts offered technical partnerships, citing decades of experience in industrial cassava processing. In Asia, traders began running calculations, wondering how millions of tons of Burkinabe starch might disrupt markets long dominated by Thailand and Vietnam. Amid these high-level debates, the voices of ordinary people revealed the raw stakes. In a dusty village north of Wahiguya, a 62-year-old farmer named Musa stood before the cracked remains of his millet field. He had farmed the same land for 4 decades, watching the rains grow weaker each year. Asked about the cassava project, he leaned on his wooden staff and said simply, "If they bring water, I will plant. If it grows, my grandchildren will eat. If it fails, they will leave me behind." His words carried the weight of thousands of lives, balanced on the edge of hope and despair. Soon after, the government released detailed maps of the project zones. 4 provinces bordering Mali were marked as the first phase of planting. For supporters, the maps were proof of seriousness. For critics, they were lines on paper, disconnected from the brutal reality of desert life. Meanwhile, rumors intensified. Some claimed Russian engineers were already advising on irrigation design. Others alleged that Chinese financiers had quietly secured rights to future starch exports. Neither claim was substantiated, but the very fact that such whispers gained traction revealed a deeper anxiety, that the project, while framed as sovereignty, might secretly tether Burkina Faso to new forms of dependency. As the debate raged, Ibrahim Traoré himself remained calm. In a rare press statement, he declared, "We do not plant cassava for Europe or America. We plant it for our children, for our soil, for our future." His words resonated, yet did little to silence speculation about hidden deals behind closed doors. And so, the climax of this story took shape. The Cassava project was no longer just about agriculture. It had become a test of truth and trust. Could a nation scarred by colonial extraction, political instability, and hunger truly seize control of its destiny? Or was it marching into another trap, one disguised as opportunity? The desert now stood as a stage, its sands whispering both promise and peril. And as the first irrigation trenches were dug, a question echoed not just in Burkina Faso, but across the world. Is this the birth of Africa's green revolution, or the beginning of a new dependency wrapped in green leaves? Stay with us, because the next revelations about funding and control are even more explosive than the dream itself. The Cassava project did more than stir debate. It began reshaping the very fabric of Burkinabe society. For decades, ordinary citizens had grown accustomed to disappointment, failed harvests, empty markets, and government promises that dissolved like mist. Now, for the first time in living memory, a vision of abundance was painted across the horizon. But that vision carried both hope and fracture. In the crowded neighborhoods of Ouagadougou, conversations shifted. Women selling maize flour wondered aloud if cassava bread would replace their traditional stalls, lowering prices but also cutting into their earnings. Young men, jobless for years, lined up at recruitment centers when the government announced plans for agricultural cooperatives to manage the new fields. For many, the project was not just about food but about dignity. "If I can feed my family by working the land," one recruit said, "I no longer need to beg in the city." In the desert villages, the effects were even sharper. Families that once sent their children south began to speak of staying. If cassava truly took root, migration patterns that had drained the north for decades might finally reverse. Chiefs welcomed this possibility with cautious relief. A return of their youth meant not just labor, but the survival of culture, language, and tradition. Yet skepticism lingered. Elders remembered other state-led initiatives that promised much and delivered little. Their support was conditional. They wanted to see water flowing before they placed their trust in speeches. Politically, Captain Ibrahim Traoré staked his legitimacy on the project. His military-led government had seized power, promising sovereignty and survival in a time of insecurity. Now, cassava became the centerpiece of that promise. Success could elevate him from transitional leader to historic figure, the man who turned sand into bread. Failure, however, would brand him as another dreamer whose ambitions consumed scarce resources, while insurgents tightened their grip. The opposition, though weakened by years of political turbulence, seized on the project's risks. Critics argued that pouring billions into cassava while schools lacked books and hospitals lacked medicine was irresponsible. Some labeled it a distraction, a grand illusion designed to mask the worsening security situation in the north. Radio hosts amplified these voices, warning that sovereignty was not built on cassava alone. "Can we eat cassava when our villages burn?" one commentator asked. The question echoed painfully across regions where jihadist attacks remained frequent. International politics intertwined with domestic consequences. France, still smarting from Traoré's break with Paris, portrayed the project as reckless adventurism. Reports in French media painted cassava as a cover for hidden alliances with Russia or China. The Burkina Faso government dismissed these claims, but the narrative sowed doubt among urban elites who relied on foreign trade and investment. For them, cassava was not just a root, it was a geopolitical signal. At the same time, the government began to leverage the project for national unity. State television aired footage of farmers digging irrigation trenches, young women planting cuttings, and engineers setting up pumps. The message was clear. This was not only a farming project, it was a patriotic duty, a collective march towards sovereignty. Songs praising cassava spread in local languages, turning the root into a symbol of resilience. Yet cracks appeared beneath the surface. Civil society groups raised alarms about land rights. Who would control the 200,000 hectares? Would traditional communities be displaced to make way for industrial-scale farming? Rumors circulated of investors eyeing prime zones, sparking fears of land grabs disguised as development. The government promised transparency, but history had taught villagers to be wary. Security added another layer of consequence. Analysts warned that the concentration of resources, canals, reservoirs, factories, could become magnets for insurgent attacks. Protecting them would require soldiers, drawing manpower away from other fronts. Already, whispers spread among officers that the military might be stretched too thin, caught between fighting militants and guarding cassava fields. Despite these challenges, the psychological effect of the project was undeniable. For many Burkina Faso, it offered a narrative of possibility after years of despair. In sermons and speeches, cassava was described as the root of freedom and the weapon of survival. Such rhetoric inspired, but it also raised expectations to dangerous heights. If the harvests failed, the disappointment could fuel unrest rather than unity. And so, the nation stood at a crossroads. A desert crop had become more than agriculture. It was a litmus test for governance, for sovereignty, and for the people's faith in their leaders. Would cassava be the bridge that carried Burkina Faso out of hunger and dependence? Or would it become the crack that deepened political and social divisions? The answer would depend not only on water and soil, but on politics, trust, and the ability to defend a dream against both enemies and doubts. And as the first fields were planted, the world watched closely, asking the question that no Burkinabe could escape. Can a root bind a nation together, or will it tear it apart? The desert has now been mapped, the first trenches dug, and cassava shoots already rising against the sands. Yet the future remains a battlefield, not of guns alone, but of climate, politics, and markets. What lies ahead for Burkina Faso's most daring gamble? The first obstacle is water. Irrigation is the lifeline of this project, and every canal must withstand a climate growing harsher each year. Regional climate models predict that by 2030, temperatures in the Sahel could rise by 2.5 degrees Celsius with even less rainfall. If cassava endures, it will prove more than resilience. It will be defiance carved into the earth. But if the canals fail, all the promises will collapse into dust. The second challenge is security. Militants have not vanished. They linger in the northern deserts, waiting for targets that symbolize the state's strength. Irrigation systems, pumping stations, and processing plants could become new front lines. For Traore's government, defending cassava fields may prove as critical as defending the capital itself. Economically, the path forward demands diversification. Cassava is the spearhead, but the infrastructure it builds, roads, storage, irrigation, could later serve sorghum, maize, and vegetables. If the project remains tied to one crop, the nation risks dependency of a new kind. If expanded wisely, it could lay the foundation for a broader agricultural renaissance. Politically, the road is steep. Success could crown Traore as the architect of sovereignty, transforming his government's legitimacy into lasting authority. But failure could spark unrest, turning hope into fury. Ordinary citizens will not easily forgive billions spent on promises if their tables remain empty. And internationally, the stakes are immense. If Burkina Faso proves that cassava can feed millions and fuel industry, Mali, Niger, and beyond may follow, transforming the Sahel from a corridor of crisis into a belt of resilience. But global powers, threatened by a new starch competitor, may quietly resist. The road ahead is both promise and peril. The desert waits, silent and merciless, ready to test whether green fields can truly conquer its sands. And so, the final question presses forward. Will Burkina Faso's future be written in cassava leaves, or in the ashes of another failed dream? For Americans watching from afar, the cassava project in Burkina Faso may seem like a distant experiment in a forgotten desert, yet its implications reach into the very heart of global security. The United States remembers well the food crisis of 2022, when the war in Ukraine doubled bread prices worldwide. Supply chains buckled, families across continents felt the sting, and Washington saw firsthand how hunger can destabilize nations. From that perspective, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's gamble is not just about agriculture. It is about whether fragile states can secure independence in a world where food is weaponized. If cassava flourishes, Burkina Faso may stabilize its north, reduce migration pressures, and inspire neighbors to follow. That outcome would serve not only Africa, but America, easing the humanitarian burden and lowering the risks of conflict-driven displacement. But the dangers are equally clear. Rumors of Russian backing, whispers of Chinese contracts, and Gulf investments spark anxiety in Washington. A Sahel nation building food sovereignty with outside help could drift into new alliances that challenge U.S. influence in West Africa. To American strategists, cassava is no longer a humble root. It is a symbol of shifting power, a potential lever in the geopolitical contest for Africa's future. Globally, reactions split along familiar lines. Europe dismisses the project as unrealistic, an overreach doomed to fail. The global South, however, hails it as a model of defiance, proof that Africa can carve its destiny without waiting for Western aid. And so, the world asks a question that echoes across borders. Is Burkina Faso's Cassava revolution a miracle that will secure Africa's independence, or the seed of a new dependency destined to redraw alliances in ways the West cannot control? The story of Burkina Faso's Cassava revolution is more than an agricultural plan. It is a gamble written in sand and sweat. 200,000 hectares once cursed as wasteland now stand at the center of a national dream. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, success could mean more than food security. It could define his legacy as the leader who turned the desert into bread. For ordinary Burkinabe, it could mean survival, dignity, and the end of dependence on imported grain. Yet the risks remain merciless. Climate forecasts warn of harsher heat and weaker rains. Security analysts fear insurgents will target irrigation lines and factories. Economists caution that betting billions on a single crop could prove fatal if markets shift. And geopolitics looms large. Foreign powers already circle, waiting to seize a share of whatever harvest emerges. Still, the potential is staggering. If the cassava fields thrive, Burkina Faso could spark a chain reaction across the Sahel, Mali, Niger, Ghana, and beyond, transforming a region long associated with famine into a belt of resilience. And on the global stage, a nation once dismissed as fragile could suddenly stand as a starch powerhouse, rewriting supply chains from Africa to Asia. The desert, however, does not give up its secrets easily. It tests every dream with fire and dust. Which outcome will prevail? Green shoots of sovereignty or the ashes of another broken promise? Now the question turns to you. Do you see this as Africa's bold step toward independence, or just another mirage shimmering in the Sahel sun? Tell us in the comments, share this story, and subscribe to follow the truth behind Africa's most shocking gamble. Because the next harvest will not just feed Burkina Faso, it may redefine the future of an entire continent.